We're talking to Dr. DBurris-Kitchen from Tennessee State University, and the topic is the criminal justice system of the United States. And of course, Dr. Kitchen, before we had our first commercial break, we promised that we'd give you an opportunity to continue to talk about what I think you've indicated is what we call police brutality. Mm-hmm. So let's pick up at that point and talk about it.
Well, as I was saying, they had a publication and a march called October 22nd out in Southern California, where people would protest actual police brutality cases. And they published a book that was literally this thick every year to talk about people who had been shot by police. And these were not cases where the person was challenging the police officer or threatening the police officer. They were cases where the person did not have a weapon, the person's back was to the police officer. Obviously, they were not threatening the police officer in any way, and they should not have used that type of excessive force. So that's why I wanted to talk about that, is because I think that there's still some obvious problems. If you have a group that can come up with that many people who've been victims of that type of crime every year and protest, literally hundreds of thousands protest this on October 22nd, then it's a problem. I wanted to kind of go back to the legal code and how it came out of European history, because I think that's going to lead up to our final discussion as far as racial disparities, because you talked about that just a little bit. When we talk about coming out of the legal code, the first laws that were written were basically to protect property rights owners in the United States, and those property rights owners were European Americans. So excluded from protection from the legal code were obviously Native Americans, African Americans who were brought here and were not U.S. citizens or United States citizens. And because of that, the laws that were written to protect property rights were usually written as repressive laws against those who didn't have access to ownership of property, whether it was Native Americans or whether it was people who were brought here from Africa against their will. Because of that legislation, people of color were criminalized very early in our history, and continued to be criminalized throughout American history up until the 1865 13th Amendment of abolishing slavery was passed. And once they abolished slavery, they put in that with exclusion of, okay, slavery is abolished, but with exclusion of those who have been convicted of a felony offense, and slavery could be used in order as a form of a punishment. So they still use that part of that legislation to enslave predominantly African-American people who were convicted of crimes that they did not get their due process for. So it would go into the court, and of course they would not get a jury. If they did, they certainly didn't get a jury, their peers, and it was one person's word against another, and of course the white person's word was the word of the law, so the person of color was convicted of a particular crime and probably put right back on the plantation that they were freed from a few years prior.
Now, would this be something similar to what you call the chain gang system, that many of these individuals had somehow gone against the law, but it might not be illegal in terms of what they did, but in the end they would be placed back into a situation where they were basically enslaved once again?
Absolutely.
Is that the so-called chain gang system? Is that
yes, that would be part of the chain gang system. Many of the people were put right back on the slave property that they were on prior to being freed from the 1865 legislation. So absolutely. And then of course we had in our legal code that separate but equal. You know, Plessy versus Ferguson was saying also that it was illegal for an African American to go into white establishments or you know, sit at the front of the bus or whatever it was that they were segregated from school systems. So that was in place until Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. So we've had legal segregation, we've had legal discrimination in this country for years, in which African Americans have been prosecuted because of this legal written documentation. And it wasn't until probably 1965 civil rights legislation started to be put into place that legal segregation and legal discrimination was almost completely abolished. So the criminal justice system has always been or had repressive laws against people of color in American history. And then once you look at not only the laws but the court system and the fact that due process has never been a part of African American or Native American history, or anyone that wasn't a white European American in this
When you
country.
say due process, explain that and how.
Jury of your peers, a fair trial, speedy trial. This stuff was never accessible until probably until 1960s legislation for African Americans or other people of color or women or different groups that have been discriminated historically up until that point. So I think that's an important history to understand before we get into the racial disparities, because without that history, then it's going to be difficult to understand where we came from there as far as once the civil rights legislation was passed, what's happened since then that's led to even more racial disparities, which you would think would be the opposite.
In other words, this is almost a continuation of what has already happened. And it really should not be surprising, I would imagine, to a person involved in the criminal justice system, like yourself, that this is happening. This is deja vu in many instances.
That they wouldn't find new repressive laws to make sure that a population that's been discriminated against historically continues to be discriminated against. Absolutely. So when we look at the war on drugs specifically, that's what I want to get into a little bit later. When we look at the war on drugs specifically, you can see that that's what's been the repressive law of today, of contemporary society, to make sure that there's overrepresentation of people of color that are coming through the criminal justice system, just like de jure segregation was used in the past, to make sure that the criminal justice system was flooded with African Americans.
Very good. And of course, Doctor, we have just about a minute to go before the end of this second segment. But I think that that's the kind of information that we wanted you to give us, because I think that it broadens our point of view in terms of the problems that we will have to face in terms of the challenges. And as you've indicated, that this is something that has always been a part of the American experience. And I think that the more people recognize that this has been a part of the system, then it's easier to deal with it when you think in terms of trying to reform. And I think that the system can be reformed. And I think that there has been quite a bit of reform within the system, but still, it's a real problem. And of course, we'll talk about that as an issue later on during this final segment. And of course, we encourage our audience to continue tune in after this second commercial break. The